And we are live. Hey, Carl. Hi. Thanks for joining.
Hi, Roman.
I think we will give it, I don't know, a minute or two for the others to join, and then we will slowly start. But apart from that, we need to keep the small talk going. So, how is the weather?
Oh, it's beautiful here. I live in Portland, Oregon, which is way in the northwest of the U.S., and uh, we get a lot of rain here. It's like Seattle. Everybody knows how rainy Seattle is, right? Well, Portland is the same. It's just very close to Seattle. But this week is gorgeous. Last week was very nice. In fact, we got up to almost 90 degrees Fahrenheit a couple of days ago, which was too warm. But this week will be great. And this week is big for me because I get to go on a wine tasting trip in Washington. That's my favorite thing to do is wine tasting. So that's always a fun thing.
That is fabulous. You should definitely go to Vienna. If you haven't been there, they have a really nice vineyard outside of the city. It's on the hill, and you can see the city from there. So that's really something to check
Sounds
out.
lovely. I don't think there's any point in traveling if wine is not somehow involved.
No. I mean, if you go to Italy, then definitely the first thing you do, you book the wine tasting, and then you do Rome, and that's about it.
Sounds good.
Okay,
So where are you located?
Oh, right now I'm in Krakow in Poland, but I'm
Oh, okay.
originally from Belarus. And
Mhm.
you also joined a couple of our events when we were live streaming from there. So that was really nice from your side. Let me just quickly check how many people do we have, and I think we can slowly start. Okay. So yeah, I think people will still be joining. So I will just gonna start with my org part, and then we will move into the presentation. So then, hi everyone again. Thanks for joining. Today we're excited to welcome you to the Global Business Analysis Community event. A couple of points before we begin. This session is being recorded and will be available after the event on official Global BA Community YouTube page and their community pages. We also encourage you to leave your questions via chat on YouTube and their community live stream, and we will do our best to address as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker. And I'm gonna try not to fail now. Today we have Karl Wiegers, who is principal consultant with Process Impact, a software development consulting and training company in Portland, Oregon, US. He is the author, as everyone knows, of more than 14 books and about 300 articles on a variety of topics. Karl also has a PhD in organic chemistry, which he has always regarded as a perfect background for anyone in IT. Karl's other interests include military history, wine tasting, as we just learned, volunteering, wine tasting, playing guitar, wine tasting, recording songs, and wine tasting again. And I think that's about it from my end, Karl. Thanks for joining, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Roman. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen here. And give me 1 second. This is my first experience with StreamYard, so I might do something wrong, but I think we've got it right. So if all went well, you can see my screen here. So I've been interested for, oh, great, thanks for letting me know. I've been interested for many years in how software teams can improve the ways that they develop and manage their requirements. When I was a software developer at Kodak around 1985, my team came up with the product champion model that we used for working with our customer representatives. We started prototyping. We adopted a standard requirement specification template. We started drawing analysis models and things like that. And we found all these activities were valuable. They gave us better results than whatever it was we used to do. And this interest eventually led me to writing several books on requirements and doing a lot of training and consulting in this area. And one of the fun things about doing training and consulting is you meet a lot of people, so you can observe patterns of approaches that work well and also things that don't work very well. So some of you might be familiar with this book, if I'm holding it in the right place, Software Requirements, third edition, that was a rather large book. It was nearly 650 pages long. You can see it's a big book. But it turns out that busy business analysts and product owners and product managers might not have the time to read a great big book. Of course, you don't have to read the whole thing. You just read the parts that you care about at the moment. But I realized that I could distill down the many practices contained in this book and other similar big books into a core set of 20 practices that I think every software team ought to perform. So a year or so ago, Candase Hokanson and I wrote this much shorter book called Software Requirements Essentials. And as you can see, it's quite a lot thinner than the big book, but there's still a lot of information in there. And one of the important things to keep in mind is that these 20 practices apply regardless of the type of product you're building, regardless of the team's development lifecycle. They apply to agile projects as well as they apply to traditional and hybrid projects. So today I want to tell you about those 20 core practices that I think are essential to be a success. Now, as we go along here, think about the extent to which each of these practices might apply to your situation. And I hope you'll make some notes about ways that you could maybe improve your requirements or reduce project risk by doing some of these things that maybe you aren't already doing. Let me point out at the lower right here, the website for this book, softwarerex.com. There you can read reviews of the book. You can see some videos. I created last year a video series called the 1 Minute Analyst, which has a bunch of short videos on these practices. You can also download many useful checklists, templates, spreadsheet tools. I'll mention some of those as we go along. I also might mention that there's a publication platform called medium.com, and I have more than 120 articles posted on my medium.com account. So if you go to medium.com, you can see about those as well. So I'm going to get started here, and I like to have my camera off during these parts of the session. So hopefully the camera is now turned off, because I don't want to be a distraction to you as we're going along here. I want you to look at the slides and listen to me instead of seeing a little talking head in the corner. So hopefully I'm now invisible, and that will be, I think, a little bit easier for us. So the 20 practices are grouped into 6 categories. First, I'll tell you about 5 practices that lay a solid foundation for project success. The other practices are grouped into the 5 subdivisions of requirements engineering. There are 4 core practices on requirements elicitation, followed by 4 more on requirements analysis, another 4 on requirements specification, 1 practice on validating requirements, and finally 2 critical requirements management practices. Now, of course, these are by no means the only techniques that a skilled BA should have in their toolkit. There are many big books on requirements and business analysis, and they describe dozens of additional practices. I think one of the recent BA books has more than 100 practices in it. These are all valuable in various situations, but I believe that these 20 are the most important ones. Now, in this short presentation, I'm not going to describe each of these practices in detail. I'll show you all of the practices in each category, and then I'll drill down into one in each category. Just a little note on terminology. When I say requirements here, I'm referring to whatever kind of objects your project uses to represent information about stakeholder needs and to describe the solution's capabilities and characteristics. So we need to put some adjectives in front of the word requirements. There are business requirements, user requirements, functional and non-functional requirements. You might be using use cases. I'm a big fan of use cases. You're probably using user stories. You might talk about features. Whatever you use, whatever word you use to describe the things that contain this kind of information, that's what I mean when I'm talking about requirements. So if your project team doesn't use that word requirements, You can do a global replace with whatever term is more comfortable for your team. Really, every project has requirements. They may be stated or not. They might be carefully considered or not. They might be documented in some form or not. But a good set of requirements lets you answer some important and universal questions that lay the foundation for a successful project. There are questions like this. Probably everybody would like to know, why are we working on this effort? What are we trying to build? It's good to know who your stakeholders are. Who are we trying to satisfy? Let's understand priorities. What do we implement first? What do we do after that? What do we talk about but maybe never do, and that's okay? How can we tell if our solution is good enough? And everybody would like to know how to tell when we're done. It's hard for me to think of a project, a team, or a group of stakeholders that wouldn't find the answers to these questions helpful. You might ask yourself, if someone asked you these questions about your project, would you, or maybe someone else, be able to give good answers? I hope so. Now, there are several actions you can take early in an initiative to get the information that lets you answer these kinds of questions. And that's what lays the foundation for a successful project. The answers to those questions ensure that the team's going to address the right problem. They align everyone toward common objectives. They make sure you engage the right participants, and it keeps the team's efforts focused. So let's look at those first 5 practices that we recommend to help all projects get that solid foundation for success. Have you ever seen a project that built and delivered a solution, but then discovered they were solving the wrong problem? Let's understand the problem before we converge on a solution. Organizations launch initiatives to solve a business problem or maybe to exploit an opportunity. However, sometimes those problems or opportunities are not explicitly stated or documented. Don't presume that either a presented problem or a presented solution is necessarily correct. Instead, do some root cause analysis to make sure the problem is well understood and that whatever solution you propose actually makes sense. The stakeholders need to understand why the initiative is being launched and its business objectives. I'll talk more about this shortly. When you launch some new initiative, you might not know where to draw the line between what the solution should and should not include. So an important foundational practice is to establish that what's in and what's out boundary. That's a solution scoping action. Every project has stakeholders who are individuals or groups that are actively involved in the project, or they're affected by the project, or they can influence its direction. I suggest you cast a large net to identify many potential stakeholders. Then you can decide who can best represent the needs of each stakeholder group and how the team should engage with them most effectively. Every project faces many requirements-related decisions. These include things like resolving conflicts, both within and across user classes, prioritizing requirements. We need to evaluate proposed requirement changes and so forth. So it's important to determine who the decision makers will be for these various requirements issues. And I suggest that you determine that before the group confronts their first significant decision. Also, each group of decision makers needs to choose a decision rule. That is, how are they going to resolve issues? So let's now take a closer look at practice number 2 here, define business objectives. I think understanding the business problem or opportunity is an essential first step toward both product and project success. The next step is to describe exactly what the project sponsor or other important stakeholders expect the solution to accomplish, the business objectives. Business objectives can be financial or non-financial. They can be internal, like operations, or outward-facing, like products. They can be strategic or tactical. It doesn't matter, so long as we know what we're trying to accomplish with this project. It's also a good idea to define some success metrics so you can tell if you have achieved, or at least you're on the path to achieving, those objectives. These kinds of business-oriented requirements lead to defining a solution concept that you're confident will satisfy the business objectives. We also need to define the scope and limitations that bound the solution. I like that phrase, scope and limitations. That actually comes from organic chemistry, which is my background, although I've been out of chemistry for a long time. If an organic chemist invents a new reaction that changes chemical type A into chemical type B, they write a paper, and a section of that is always scope and limitations. What will the reaction do? What will the reaction not do? And we should do the same thing in our projects. I've seen a few requirement specifications that did a very nice job of saying, and here's some things that people might expect are going to be in the solution, but they're not. So let's draw those boundaries. So that information all will ultimately let the team elicit the detailed requirements that describe the solution's capabilities and its characteristics. Well, why is this valuable? A clear set of business objectives help the team identify those key stakeholders who will work with the BA to understand their needs and to define the necessary functionality that has to be in the solution. The decision makers can set the priorities of individual requirements based on the objectives, and they can define the contents of each development increment or product release so as to align with achieving the most important and most timely business objectives. So defining the business objectives lets us determine when the business problem is solved, or when the need is fulfilled, or the opportunity is exploited. Now, it's easy to state vague goals, but I think it's better if you can write your requirements to be specific, quantitative, and measurable. Otherwise, it's hard to tell if you've achieved them. So here's a tool that we can use to help us accomplish that, a business objectives model. This is a valuable tool for a thorough analysis for complex problems in which you might have multiple business problems and business objectives all intertwined together. And if you go to the website for the book, softwarerex.com, you can download a brief paper that talks about the business objectives model. So the business objectives model is a way to visually link problems to objectives, to their associated success metrics, and to the resultant solution concept. Here's a partial example for a proposed system, a restaurant online ordering system. We all got used to doing that a lot during COVID. So here's our first business problem. Our revenue from our main target market of 18 to 35-year-olds is too low. Okay, well, that sounds like something we want to do something about. And that leads to an objective we'd like to accomplish. We want to increase the monthly revenue for our target market to, let's say, $28,000. Obviously, this is just an example. So we can see a direct connection between our objective and our problem. And then we can start asking ourselves, well, how are we going to do that? What kind of solution do we build to accomplish that? And as we think through the restaurant's business situation, we uncover additional problems and corresponding business objectives, and we can state as many of those as we need to. And then our analysis can lead us to conceive a solution that we think would address all those problems and hopefully achieve our desired business outcomes. And you can see with the arrows here how you can tie specific major solution features back to individual business objectives. Here's a little safety tip. If you come up with a solution concept and you have features in there that don't relate to a particular business objective, you might ask yourself, well, why it's in there. Okay. So this kind of analysis, I think, is much better than just thinking of a cool looking solution first and then hoping it will give you the business outcomes you desire. I was talking to a woman I met at a wine tasting event. How about that? A little while ago, and she had a very interesting idea for a phone app, which coincidentally also had to do with restaurants. And she started building prototypes with the help of a technical person and stuff. And she hadn't really thought through her business objectives yet. So you might come up with a really cool product that doesn't do what you hope it's going to do. So that's a problem. All right, so those are some of the things you do to lay a foundation for success. And you don't want to skip those because otherwise you're going to have to deal with them later, and they may make it much harder to achieve what you hope to achieve. So let's talk about requirements elicitation. This is the first step in dealing with requirements, is to get some. People often speak of gathering requirements, but it's not just a simple collection process. I think a better term is requirements elicitation. That does include collection, certainly, but it also involves exploring, discovering, and even inventing requirements. So those are all parts of the elicitation process. Requirements can come from many sources. The BA needs to look for requirements from various user representatives, subject matter experts, and other stakeholders. You might have documentation about business processes or current systems or competing products. There are probably applicable laws and other business policies that you have to be aware of. You might have a stack of user problem reports that give you some ideas. So there are many places requirements might come from, and there are many ways to look for them. So the skilled BA has many elicitation techniques in their toolkit. And a lot of them are a matter of talking to people, either in individual interviews or in facilitated group workshops. You can learn a lot by observing users at work. They'll do things as you look over their shoulder that they might not think to tell you about if you just ask them what they do. You can use surveys or questionnaires if you're trying to get a lot of information from different people, techniques like process modeling and others that you can use to try to find requirements wherever they might be hiding. Here are 4 core requirements elicitation practices. On the next slide, we'll discuss understanding what users need to do with the solution. Let me talk about that for just a moment. So I wrote a book, I guess it was 2 books ago, called Software Development Pearls, which describes 60 lessons I've learned about software development since I started programming in college in 1970, a long time ago. Somebody asked me not too long ago, well, what do you think is the most important lesson you've learned in all that time? And I thought about it, and this is it. That I think the most important lesson about how to build high quality software is to first understand what users need to do with the solution. So we're going to come back to that. All systems react to various kinds of events that trigger some response. There could be business events that launch a use case, signal events like inputs from a switch or sensor, or a particular data value from an outside system. There could be temporal or time-triggered events that lead to some system behavior. So event analysis is a good elicitation technique for many kinds of products, particularly real-time products. All software systems process data. So you assess data concepts and their relationships. Data modeling is a powerful technique for this purpose. And besides functionality, for every product, you need to explore quality attributes. These are a category of non-functional requirements. In fact, when people say non-functional requirements, usually this is what they're thinking about, what are also called quality attributes. One reason this is important is because there are often trade-offs between these various quality characteristics such that you cannot optimize all of them at once. And a good example of that is a trade-off between usability and security. You know, we're so concerned about security these days, thanks to a relatively small number of very unpleasant people who do bad things. And so a lot of people are using functional or, multi-level authentication. I didn't say the right phrase there, but multi-factor, thank you, that's what I'm thinking of. Multi-factor authentication to make sure we're who we say we are so that we end up using multiple devices to log into a website, say. Well, that's certainly inconvenient for usability, but it improves security. So there are trade-offs that mean you can't optimize everything at the same time. So let's look at this practice about understanding what users need to do. Suppose you were holding a requirement solicitation discussion with some users, like this new user shown here, about some new information system. Which of these questions do you think would yield the greatest insights? Should we ask, what do you want? Or maybe we should ask, what are your requirements? How about, what do you want the system to do? Or what features would you like to see in the system? That's one thing with it comes up with user stories is we sometimes focus on the features to put in. But I think a better question is to ask, what do you need to do with the solution? Okay, that is a small change in the question that we're asking, but it's a powerful change in the perspective. It shifts the discussion from a focus on the product to a focus on the users, and more specifically on usage. People talk about user-centric elicitation or user-centric design. Let's talk about usage-centric things instead of user-centric. So focusing on features during elicitation can lead the team to implement incomplete functionality that might not let the users do all the things they must do because we're focusing on the feature. We just hope it lets them do the things they do. But this is, I think, a very important idea and something that I learned a long time ago and have tried to keep in mind. Now, if you look at the IIBA model, the three-level model for requirements, which is kind of based in part, I think, on a three-level model I had developed earlier, their middle level is stakeholder requirements. Okay, you got business requirements at the top, then you have stakeholder requirements, and then they have solution requirements. Well, I don't think stakeholder requirements is very helpful because in reality, as far as I can tell, all requirements come from some stakeholder. Where else would they come from? But here, I'm talking about my model. It's a little bit different where that middle level is user requirements. We're talking specifically about requirements from that subset of stakeholders who will actually use the solution in some way. So what we want to do is make sure that our user requirements align with achieving the project's business objectives. Of course, this implies that you need to define those business objectives first, as we saw a few minutes ago. People very naturally focus on describing the way the system's going to function when all goes well. Sometimes that's called the happy path. But in addition to exploring these normal success scenarios, you also need to consider alternative ways the user might want to accomplish a task, as well as exceptions that could prevent successful completion potentially. From these user requirements, the BA can then identify the necessary functionality the solution must include to let users get those jobs done. And by making sure that the specified functionality aligns with these known user tasks, you can avoid a common trap. Maybe this has happened to you. Users tell you they need something, so you build it, and then you find out no one ever used it. That's pretty frustrating. So you're less likely to waste time and effort implementing functionality that seemed like a good idea at the time, but goes unused if we're focusing on usage and not on features. That's a frustrating experience that I suspect some of you have had. So how are we going to take this usage-centric approach? Well, two commonly used techniques for exploring user requirements are use cases and user stories. It can be a little challenging to steer elicitation participants from thinking about product features to focusing on usage. I find that use cases provide a nicely structured way to facilitate that change in the thought process. And a couple of months ago, I posted an article on my Medium account that says, it's titled something like Use Cases, the Business Analyst's Best Friend. And it describes why I think that is a valuable technique. The name of the use case defines the goal the user is trying to accomplish. So maybe someone who posts articles on a publication platform like medium.com wants to view article statistics. That's something I do regularly. So that becomes a use case name, view article statistics. So you'll notice that this starts with a verb, and that's one of the solid rules about use cases is they always start with a verb that describes some action. Here's a little tip. Whenever you hear an elicitation participant say, I want to do something, or I need to be able to do something, that do something very possibly is a use case. You can have a use case template for specifying it that contains categories that fully describe the use case. We want to perhaps list some preconditions that must be satisfied before the system can execute the use case. There could be postconditions that are true after successful completion. There's a series of steps that take place in a dialogue between the user and the system. We want to talk about how to handle things that could go wrong, identify pertinent business rules, and other information. So you can download a use case template from softwarerex.com that gives you some categories to think about as you're exploring these. And then the BA can derive all the necessary functional requirements that developers must implement to realize the use case. Also, and this was not obvious to me in the first place when I did use cases on a project, testers can easily create tests from the use case specification as well. That's a really powerful quality aid, pushing testing into the requirements thinking part of the project. User stories are typically employed on agile projects as a primary requirements deliverable. And a user story is typically written according to a pattern that provides a little more information and context than the use case name does. It tells us the type of user who cares about this and motivation or rationale behind the request. So a user story for this same function I was describing might say, as an author, okay, now we know who cares. I want to, view the statistics. There's basically the same phrase as the use case name, view the statistics for my articles so that I can see which topics my readers enjoy the most. Okay, now we understand the rationale, why this is a valuable thing for us to do. Now, rather than writing detailed functional requirements, agile projects typically provide the story details through a set of acceptance criteria that the implemented story must satisfy. Requirements and tests are complementary thought processes. They're showing the same information in different ways. Requirements say, here's what to build, and tests say, here's how to tell if we built the right thing correctly. Okay, either one is fine. They're both telling you the same information. So with both use cases and user stories, I think the key to success is to keep the focus on understanding user goals, not on describing little bits of system functionality. We'll figure that out once we understand the goals. Once you've elicited some requirements, we need to analyze them. But what exactly does it mean to analyze requirements? I was kind of surprised when I was writing this book, Software Requirements Essentials. I looked at a number of other sources of information. And some of the books on business analysis and requirements didn't even have an entry in the index for requirements analysis, which I thought was a little strange. Analysis kind of sounds like something that just sort of happens through staring at the requirements long enough. But in reality, you can use several techniques to search for specific problems and produce better requirements, which will probably lead to better solutions. Analyzing requirements is where a skilled BA can really add some value. Analysis is an incremental and iterative process. It's interwoven with ongoing requirements elicitation, specification, and validation activities. But really what we're trying to do here is to analyze the requirements to ensure that the needs of all the stakeholders are understood and documented appropriately. And appropriately means in whatever level of detail and precision is right for your situation. The outcome of successful analysis ensures that the team can build a satisfactory solution to meet those needs. We find that solution, we've agreed upon it, we can build it and test it. Analysis involves multiple thought processes. We're trying to confirm completeness, clarity, and correctness. You ask questions to make sure you understand what each requirement is saying. Analysis also involves detailing requirements to an appropriate level. And the level that we're trying to aim for is to reduce the risk of having to do excessive unplanned rework. I hate rework. I hate doing things over that I've already done once. Now, there's always some of that, and it can be valuable for our projects, but let's not do any more of it than we have to. So thinking is a lot faster and cheaper than recoding, in my opinion. One of the things we can do is to compare multiple representations of information to try to spot errors and fill in knowledge gaps. We can show information in different ways. So along the way here, you're confirming and refining your knowledge of each requirement. There are 4 essential requirements analysis practices. First is to simply analyze both individual requirements and sets of requirements. I'll discuss this further in just a moment. A real turning point in my background in education about software development was when I learned about modeling, analysis and design modeling. Drawing visual diagrams or models of requirements is a really powerful technique. It completely changed how I approached software development. So I've been a fan of requirements modeling for many years. People often create prototypes which are possible or preliminary or partial implementations, both to better understand the problem and to refine and validate requirements for some part of the solution. Also, since no team can implement all of its requirements simultaneously, they must prioritize them to make sure the team delivers the most important capabilities in the right sequence to maximize the delivered value. Here are the major aspects of analyzing individual requirements. There are 10 activities here. Let's see what they do and what they are, and I think you'll find that you probably do some of these already. First, we should be able to trace each stakeholder request, or maybe a business policy, a quality attribute, or some other source that led us to include it. If anyone asks why a particular requirement is present, the BA should have a compelling answer. A big aspect of analysis is to decompose large or high-level requirements into a sufficient level of detail to make sure they're well understood and can be implemented without having to do a lot of question answering. Analysis also involves deriving functional requirements from the various parts of a use case, a story, business rules, or other sources. If you've ever been a developer, you know that developers write a lot of code to handle exceptions that could prevent successful execution. So during analysis, identify those possible error conditions. These could be user actions or system conditions or maybe data values, and figure out how the system should detect and handle them. Experienced BAs automatically scan for certain characteristics as they review requirements. They should be correct, complete, feasible, necessary, unambiguous, and so on. We've all seen those lists. You'll never get perfect requirements, but keep these characteristics in mind as you write and review them. Consider how someone could judge whether the requirement was correctly implemented and ready for use. That is, its acceptance criteria. People often make unstated assumptions regarding requirements, but conflicting and obsolete assumptions can cause problems later. Constraints restrict developers' design or implementation options. Confirm whether any constraints that you spot embedded in the requirements, are they true restrictions or are they just solution ideas that someone proposed? Business rules often influence or serve as the source of specific pieces of functionality or data. It's important to know which rules apply to which processes, functions, and data objects. We'll come back to business rules a little bit later. Products that pose safety risks must include hazard analysis as part of their requirements analysis. And think about the risks that any requirement could pose to the project's success, whether it was included or not included. Requirements reuse involves both crafting requirements that can be reused in other contexts and finding existing functionality that your application could exploit. So consider both of those reuse aspects during analysis. So these kinds of analysis techniques will become second nature eventually as you get in the habit of applying them. But in the meantime, it's helpful to have a checklist. So if you go to softwarerex.com, you can download checklists that remind you of these various analytical techniques for individual requirements, and also 8 things you can do to analyze sets of requirements. It's hard to see the requirements that aren't there. They're invisible. And finding missing requirements kind of involves reading between the lines. To assess completeness, you can trace downward from business objectives through to the solution requirements to make sure everything aligns properly. Look out for inconsistencies. They can arise between a parent requirement and its children, but requirements of the same type also could conflict. One might say do A, another one says to do B, but it's logically impossible to do both. Look for multiple instances of the same information. I once reviewed for a client several use cases that had nearly, but not exactly, the same data structure definition in 3 of the use cases. But they weren't the same. And then the reader doesn't know which one to believe, if any. They could all be wrong, but they can't all be right if they don't match. Replicating information also raises the chance of generating an inconsistency if you change one instance, but other instances of it, other copies, are not changed at the same time. I think it's better to point to a single source of the information instead of duplicating it. So for example, instead of putting this data structure definition in 3 use cases that all use it, I would put that in a data dictionary so someone knows that's where I go to get the definition of this data object. Some requirements depend on others being implemented at the same time or previously. For instance, it only makes sense to implement exception handling code concurrently with the functionality where the error could occur. Beyond these desirable characteristics of being complete and consistent, let's make sure that groups of requirements are written and labeled in a way to make them modifiable and traceable. So we want to have some kinds of identifiers to distinguish our requirements. Creating multiple representations of requirements using different thought processes lets you compare them to find problems. You can show requirements in text, or in diagrams, or in tables, or in mathematical expressions, in prototypes. There are a lot of ways to show this information. Then we can compare them. The problem is, if you represent knowledge in only one form, and it doesn't matter which form that is, but if you create it in only one form, you are forced to believe it. You have to trust it. That's all you have. But if you represent it in more than one form using different thought processes, then you can compare those. And every time I've done that, I found errors. So I think that's a valuable technique. Earlier, I mentioned the importance of prioritizing requirements. And stakeholders sometimes assume that the solution will include certain functionality without them having to say so explicitly. But I have found that telepathy and clairvoyance, that is, mind reading and seeing the future, those are not very effective requirements elicitation tools. Excuse me. All right, so moving on to the next category, the next domain of requirement specification. That term refers to 2 things, both the recording of requirements knowledge, that's one form of requirement specification, and the deliverable you produce may also be called a software requirement specification. And here on this slide, we see the very first BA in the world writing the very first requirement specification. Actually, that's Charles Dickens, but close enough. Now, I want to suggest that whenever you see the phrase writing requirements, you mentally change that to say representing requirements knowledge. Natural language text is the most popular way to record requirements because that's how people normally communicate. But there are all these alternatives, tables and models and tests and so forth. Some people don't like to write requirements. They think it's a waste of time. But in my experience, the cost of recording knowledge is small compared to the cost of acquiring that knowledge or reacquiring it in the future by, say, reverse engineering. Excuse me 1 second here.
Hey everyone. For those who are watching us online, just give Karl a second. He will be back shortly.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now? I think we're okay.
Yes, all good.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, wait for my morning allergy medications to come back into working for me, so I had to clear my throat there. All right, so where were we? Well, one of the problems with recording knowledge or not recording knowledge is that human memories are imperfect. They're incomplete. They fade and they distort over time, and other people can't access them. So I think documented requirements are valuable because they constitute a type of persistent group memory. I like that phrase, group memory. Requirements can be stored in different structures. They can be documents, spreadsheets, databases, a requirements management tool, sticky notes on a wall, whatever works for you. They vary in the information they contain, how that information is organized, how much detail, and so forth. So think of your requirements spec as simply being a container for requirements-related knowledge, no matter what form it takes. And remember that the goal of writing any kind of requirements is always clear and effective communication. That's the only reason we do it. And there are many ways to achieve that. So 2 core specification practices are to write the various kinds of requirements you encounter in consistent ways, according to recognizable patterns, and to ignore that, to organize that information in some structured fashion with the help of a template. I'm going to talk in a moment about the importance of identifying and documenting business rules. Also, it's a good idea to create a glossary because a common vocabulary helps the participants avoid misunderstandings. Have a glossary of significant terms, abbreviations, acronyms, synonyms, to make sure that everyone understands them in the same way. As a business analyst, you're in the communication business. That is your primary function. And so we want to make sure that happens clearly and effectively. Let's talk a little bit about business rules. I have a friend named Jeremy, and not too long ago, he visited his local blood bank's website and made an appointment to donate blood later that day. Good for Jeremy. It's a good thing to do. But when Jeremy got to the blood bank, the staff told him, oh, we don't take same-day appointments, even though the website let him make a same-day appointment. Jeremy was annoyed. So what happened here? Well, business rules are statements that define or restrict certain aspects of an organization's operations, or they influence the behaviors of people and systems within the organization. They're not software requirements in themselves, but business rules often lead to derived requirements to enforce or comply with the rule. And as such, they're a critical piece of the requirements puzzle on every project. And the blood bank's website dropped the ball on that issue by not enforcing the no same-day appointment policy. There are several types of business rules. Some simply state facts about the business. Many rules impose constraints on who can do what under what conditions. For example, privilege levels and security rules will impose constraints. Action enablers trigger some system or business behavior, and computations describe how certain calculations are performed. Business rules come from various sources. Company policies constitute a large source, like, say, a store's policies for issuing refunds. Many systems must comply with various laws and regulations. Industry standards, such as interface standards, are another major source of rules. But too often, business rules are not documented at all, or they're embedded in the code. Sometimes in some organizations, they're treated sort of as a corporate folklore we exchange around the campfire. But it's better to document business rules like you document requirements. They should be clear, complete, consistent, unambiguous, and so forth. So business rules are subject to the same problems that can afflict requirements also. One rule could conflict or overlap with another. A rule might be obsolete or based on assumptions that are no longer valid. Rules could be imprecise or cover certain conditions. And as with requirements, textual rules aren't always the best way to communicate information. Let's look at an example. Suppose you have an online store and you offer various combinations of discounts and free shipping to your customers, depending on the total price of an order and whether the customer is a club member. You could write out all those rules in natural language, but displaying them in the form of a decision table like this is easier to understand. So I think a decision table is a very useful technique for every BA to have in their toolkit. The decision table shows all the possible combinations of conditions. So we've got 2 conditions up here. Depends on the total price of the order and whether or not the customer is a club member. And those various combinations lead to various actions. We've got 4 possible actions, different amounts of discount and whether or not they get free shipping. So the various values for the order total and club membership lead to a specific action. Let's look at an example. Rule discount 5 states that if the order total is in the $50 to $100 range inclusive, we need to be very, very specific on that. So we know is $50, are these boundaries included in this category or they're in another one? So make that clear. And the customer is a club member, yes. Then what happens? Well, the X says they'll get a 10% discount, and this X says they also get free shipping. So representing business logic with decision tables helps to avoid boundary problems, boundary value problems like 50 or 100 being in the right column, and it helps you avoid missing logical combinations. This compact table format is easier to create, to read, and modify than a big set of very similar repetitive rules. Also, another point, a decision table facilitates test design to ensure that we don't miss any condition combinations. So add that to your toolkit if you're not already familiar with decision tables. Well, let's see where we are here. By this point in the development process, the requirements development process, you understand the project's business objectives. You've elicited requirements for some portion of the solution from various stakeholders, analyzed those requirements, and recorded them in appropriate forms. So the team's now ready to begin development on that portion of the product, right? Maybe. Yes, you have some requirements, but how do you know they're the right requirements? Are you confident that they'll meet the user's goals and address the business situation that led to launching the initiative in the first place? You could have a set of beautifully written and modeled requirements that appear to be crystal clear, complete, and unambiguous, and yet they could still be wrong. So requirements validation activities strive to confirm that some set of requirements accurately describes stakeholder needs, and to confirm that a solution based on those requirements would indeed satisfy those needs and achieve the intended business objectives. The terms verification and validation are often confused or misused. Verification confirms that whatever you've done was done correctly and to specification, doing the thing right. Validation ensures that you're doing the right thing. So requirements validation is to make sure we have the right requirements to build the right product. And as with analysis, the validation activities are woven in together with the other ongoing requirements development activities. So how do we do this? Well, prototypes and early releases of your solution, or even delivering the full solution, those are ways to validate with customers whether or not you're building the correct solution, but those can be rather expensive, and you don't get much feedback until you've actually built something. So a core practice for ongoing requirements validation involves a combination of reviewing requirements and testing them before you have any code. So let's look at each of these activities. Peer review of documented requirements is a powerful quality practice. In a peer review, colleagues of the person who created a requirements artifact examine it for potential defects and other issues. Reviews are a high leverage investment in software quality in general, and requirements reviews offer the highest leverage of all. I've been a fan of peer reviews for a very long time, and I felt strongly enough about this that I wrote a book once called Peer Reviews in Software, a Practical Guide. So I think that's a real important activity, and it's also a good indication of an organization's culture. That is, are people willing to have some of their colleagues look over their work? Not just willing, but eager to have them look over their work and find possible problems before it goes downstream or goes into the customer's hands. So here are a few tips about doing good reviews. First, we need to choose the right participants. A BA might invite another analyst to review their requirements because the other BA knows what kinds of problems to look for. However, that BA can't tell if the requirements properly address the business need. So to validate the requirements, you also need reviewers who supplied the information that led to those requirements. These could be the representatives of various user classes, maybe marketing staff. If you're building a big system product, who wrote a higher level or predecessor system specification. Make sure that we've translated all that information into effective requirements. People who also base their work on the requirements, I call them victims of the requirements. They also make good reviewers. Architects, designers, data analysts, developers, and testers will all find different kinds of issues from their perspective. Second, there are different kinds of reviews that span a range of formality and rigor. The simplest just involves asking one colleague to look something over that you've created. That's an ad hoc review. In a pass around, you invite several people to examine some requirements or maybe some diagrams. Other approaches are called a team review or an inspection. Those are more structured and more formal. That makes them slower and more expensive, but also more thorough and more valuable. Everything has a trade-off. Another useful technique is to use a checklist to remind reviewers of common types of requirements errors to look for, like the things we've all seen, ambiguities, inconsistencies, duplications, and so forth. So again, with experience, you'll internalize this list, but in the meantime, the checklist is helpful, and you can download a requirements review checklist from the website softwarerex.com. So that's some tips on reviewing requirements, but this is also a very important idea, is that we can begin testing our software as soon as we define the first requirement. That truth was a real eye-opener for me when I first realized it. Tests describe how to tell if the solution is exhibiting the correct behavior and to find situations where it does not. So what we can do is figure out how to test what we think the solution would be based on the requirements. Excuse me. So long ago, I discovered that writing tests from my mental image of how the system should behave is a different thought process than writing requirements. So what I do is I take my requirements and then I'd write tests based on what I thought the system ought to do. And then I'd walk through them and map them against the requirements to ensure that every test could be performed by firing off certain requirements. And every time I did that, I found errors. I might find missing or erroneous requirements. I find missing and erroneous tests. Agile teams often write acceptance criteria in the form of tests to define a user story's details. Those tests help developers understand what to implement and how to tell if they're done. The tests also help users envision whether a story will meet their needs, which is, after all, the essence of requirements validation. A popular way to write acceptance tests uses the given, when, then pattern. Think back to the user story we saw earlier. As an author, I want to view the statistics for my articles so that I can see which topics my readers enjoy the most. Here's one acceptance test you might write for that story. We'll give it an ID, AT1. Given, that's like a precondition, I'm logged into the platform and I have articles published. Statistics aren't interesting if I have no articles. When, here's an action or an event, I request to view statistics, then some things happen here, just whatever's supposed to result from that combination of conditions and actions. So this is a nice way to write up these tests. But we can go one step further. And here's another way you can use test thinking to validate your requirements before writing any code. Suppose you've drawn a model, a diagram to complement some of your textual requirements. You can trace the logical execution path on the model with a highlighter pen as you walk through the tests and see if the system would behave as you expect. After you go through all the tests with your highlighter, look for problems. If there's a path in the model that you didn't highlight, that could indicate either that you're missing a test, or maybe that path does not reflect a legitimate system behavior. Conversely, if you have a test, but there's no path to trace in the model, either the test is invalid or the model is incomplete. Either way, by having these two representations, that disconnect tells you there's a problem. So here's an example. This is a portion of a process flow diagram for a website that lets sales representatives enter orders for a customer who's on the phone. In one scenario, the customer's requested items are all out of stock. So among many others, the tester has written the test shown here. Given that the cart is empty, because everything was out of stock, when the customer says, I don't want to order anything else, then the process should terminate. So they wrote that test. That makes sense. So now we take our highlighter pen and we try to trace the path that this test describes on the process flow, but you can't do it. The diagram says, okay, if the requested items are not in stock, is item in stock? No. Okay, I'll tell you it's out of stock. Do you want to order anything else? No, I'm done. The diagram says that the sales rep still sends an empty quote to the customer, but that doesn't match the test, and also it kind of doesn't make sense. So if we assume the test is correct, by doing this action, we found an error in the model and in any technical requirements that align with the model. So we tested our software before we had a single line of code. I think that's really useful and really powerful. So now that we have that knowledge about an error in the diagram, the BA can redraw that portion of the process model to look like this. I've added this blue diamond following the customer saying, okay, I'm all done ordering things. And now that checks to see, are there items in the cart after that dialogue? And if so, we send the quote. If not, we end the process. Let's go back to our same test and see if we've made any progress. And now we can follow the green path, and it goes exactly like it's supposed to. Okay, we end the sales process instead of sending the customer a meaningless quote with nothing in it. So finding errors like this before the team writes the code and before the customer encounters a problem, that's a good thing. You might have noticed that customers are never in a good mood when they report a problem, so I'd rather not have those conversations. Okay, we're almost done here. So far, I've described 18 practices that help you develop a set of high-quality solution requirements. Once you have those fine requirements in hand, now what happens to them? Requirements management is the subdomain of requirements engineering that deals with how requirements are used on the project and how the project responds to evolving needs. So requirements management involves several ongoing activities. You need to track versions of individual requirements as they change over time. Similarly, the status of each individual requirement changes over time as it goes through its life. It starts from being proposed to approved, and ultimately it's either verified as being correctly implemented in the product, or maybe it was deferred to a later iteration or deleted entirely. If you're serious about requirements management, you'll trace each one both backward to its origin and forward to the design elements, code, and tests that showed how it was implemented in the solution. So these are all valuable things to do, but I think the two most important requirements management practices that apply to every project are, first, establishing and managing requirements baselines, and managing changes to requirements effectively. You need to have mechanisms in place to add new requirements that come along, modify existing ones, and delete planned requirements from your backlog of pending work. Let me say a little bit about baselines here. Some people find that word scary and they shouldn't. As the BA, you've developed a set of requirements and confirmed that they describe a suitable solution. So the next step is for the development team to commit to implementing a subset of those requirements in a specific time frame or development cycle. That's all a requirements baseline is. It's an agreement of what we're going to do in a particular chunk of work. Establishing a baseline doesn't mean that change will happen. It will. But the baseline ensures everyone involved that the team can move forward with development at a low risk of major changes. So a sensible baselining and change approach ensures that everyone always knows what they should and should not be working on. You can define a baseline in two ways. A time-bound baseline begins by establishing a time box. That could be a single iteration, a group of iterations, a planned release, or even an entire product. The team then allocates the highest priority requirements from their backlog to the baseline until the time box's development and testing capacities are filled. And that's what we agree we're going to build. Alternatively, a scope-bound baseline consists of a large set of features, requirements, or stories that can be built, tested, and deployed together and are approved as a unit. With a scope-bound approach, the requirements baseline is established without necessarily knowing its size or delivery schedule. We just work on it until those requirements in the baseline are done. The baseline serves as a reference point for commencing change control of the committed requirements. That is, you make changes against the baseline. Your team should follow its defined requirements change process, whatever that is, to make sure the right people make the right decisions. Here's the part that nobody likes of my whole presentation, that this often requires renegotiating changes in scope, time, and resources for the work. That's just the reality. Change is never free. In fact, simply discussing a change and then deciding we're not going to make it, that took some time. Change is never free. There's always a price you pay. There's always a trade-off. One way to handle that is to include contingency buffers to provide some slack time in your plans to accommodate a reasonable amount of change. Otherwise, the very first new or changed requirement that comes along, or any other project surprises, can disrupt those plans and commitments. So we have covered a lot of ground quickly here today. I hope you've made some notes, practices that you feel would add value to your project, perhaps reduce risk or increase the chance of success. I cannot promise you that if you perform these 20 practices on your projects, you'll definitely be successful, but I can promise that you'll have fewer requirements-related headaches if you do. And that seems like a strong enough motivation to look into them and see if any of these practices would help your teams beef up how they plan, develop, and manage their requirements. So I have one final slide here to show you, which is an offer from the publisher, Inform IT. The book was published by Candase and Wesley, or Pearson Education. And Inform IT is their website, and they're giving you a discount code that you could use, informit.com, for either the print book or the ebook or a combination. So I am going to go back. We'll do that now, and then we can talk. Do we have any questions from anyone, Roman?
Hey, Karl, thanks. Well, we have a lot, so just give me a second. I'm just going to pull up on the screens, and I'm going to be writing them out. But yeah, thanks for the presentation. I didn't make this joke before, but I was enjoying some light reading while you were talking. So I hope you don't mind.
Excellent.
I needed to, cross-reference the facts. But yeah, it's a really good book. I saw some comments around 650, 650 pages. And I mean, I don't know as for others, but that was probably the first book that I've read when I decided to switch into business analysis, and it was super helpful. So you should be super proud that you helped a lot of people.
That's always great to hear. Thanks.
I'm sure people will join. Like if everyone can start bumping their comments, I will definitely mention some of them. All right, let's switch into questions. So the first question would be, should the business analyst be responsible for describing the how the functionality should work, like fleshing out the details of the requirements for the development purposes? That's first.
Well, I would argue that someone has to do that, and that is a business analysis activity. The BA doesn't just write down whatever user story somebody gives them and say, okay, fine, here's a bunch of stories over the wall to development, you take it from here. So I would say that whether or not the BA on a project is responsible for doing that is up to the project team and how they allocate various work to different team members. But that is a BA activity to elaborate the details into an appropriate level for development and testing to continue and work on them. So if it's not going to be the BA, who's going to do it? If you say, well, the developer does that, fine, but then you're asking the developer to function as a BA. And so long as they have the skills and knowledge and interest in doing that, fine. But that's really a matter of just allocating the various tasks on a project to specific individuals to perform them. But it's a BA function.
I mean, I can only agree.
Sort of the difference between a job title and a project role.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you. Let's take another one. So Alexander is asking, what business metrics could be used for measuring requirements management impact and effectiveness?
Well, it depends on what you want to learn. Metrics are very interesting. I've done quite a bit of work with software metrics. And a good way to think about which metrics you want to collect is to start at the end. There's a technique called GQM, goal, question, metric. And so you start by defining your goal. What do we want to learn, or what do we want to accomplish? And maybe that starts by saying, well, we feel like we have too much change in our requirements over time, and our goal is to reduce the number of changes so that we keep, changing our development work. So you choose your goal first, and from the goal, you work backward and say, okay, what questions do I have that I need those answers to those questions so I can tell if we're achieving our goal? And then you step back one more level to the metric, GQM, and say, what do we need to measure to be able to answer those questions to then be able to tell if we're achieving our goal? So every time I've gotten a question about specific metrics and I sort of try to answer off the top of my head, I find that I don't really understand why that person is asking this question. So there's no magic set of metrics. It really just depends on what you're trying to learn and what you're trying to accomplish. So you might say, well, let's count how many changes take place in each requirement and see if we're okay with that or not. Or maybe you want to count, maybe your goal is to reduce the amount of rework you do, unplanned rework, because of changes in requirements. And so then you want to measure how much rework do we do. Incidentally, when people make that measurement, when people actually take the time to see what % of our development team work is spent on rework, they usually get very scary numbers. It's much higher than they think it is. So rather than me telling you, I'll measure this, this, and this, I will say, think about what you're trying to learn, then what information you need to be able to accomplish that goal, and what we need to measure to be able to answer those questions.
Awesome, thanks. Moving next, there is one probably practical question. If on startup, the client is saying that he wants a BA to rely on his vision about the user needs, and without his approval, I think, the BA cannot reach out to other stakeholders. Is there any option the BA can argue with the client that his vision is not enough and that the client can be wrong and is most likely wrong? And PS, thank you for 650 pages of gold. So I guess that's a reference to one of the...
Right. Well, you're welcome, and thank you for the kind comment first. Yes, I think a good way to do that, and I've been in that situation where a manager said, look, my people are too busy to spend time working with you. I know what they need. I'll tell you everything you need to know. And there are several problems with that, or several risks. One is that that person's information might be out of date because the manager maybe doesn't do the job and doesn't really know real well exactly what today's users need to do their job. They did it once, but things may have changed. So their information could be obsolete. It could be incomplete. It could be too narrow. It could represent one set of needs from that manager's perspectives, but the BA might see, these people over here do something a little bit different, mostly the same, but a little bit different. And if we made a little bit of expansion in this part of the system, we could accommodate growth that maybe that manager hasn't thought about. Okay, so there are risks in doing this. And so I think that would be the way to have the conversation, is point out the risks. Rather than, maybe that manager or key stakeholder is wrong or incomplete, but they probably won't be happy if you tell them that. But you could point out the risks of what do we think could go wrong if everything comes from you. And one of the other risks is that person is probably very busy doing other things, and you may not be able to get answers to the questions that you have, the details, quickly, because they're just not available. They don't have the bandwidth to interact with the BA on a quick time basis to answer those questions and provide the information. So that's what I would do. I think if the BA is in that situation, think about what could go wrong if we pursue the approach this manager is insisting upon, and ask if they're okay with that. You might need to get their specific, explicit agreement that, yes, I accept those risks. And I know that if we do this, that could happen. And we might end up having to fix a lot of things or add things before we can say we're done with this piece of work. But if you approach it from a risk point of view, I think it's pretty hard for people to argue with that. And it may turn out that they have a good answer for some of those risks and say, we don't have to worry about this. We don't have to worry about this. Let me add one more thing about that. When people begin to work together, we often don't talk about how we're going to work together. We make assumptions about how you like to communicate based on how I like to communicate, or how much detail do you want based on how much detail I think you want. And so I think it's worth taking the time to discuss how we are going to collaborate. And so said more precisely, I think we all have both the right and responsibility to say, here's what I need from you if we are jointly going to be successful. What do you need from me? And let's just get that all out there. One of the chapters in the the big book, talks about a customer's bill of rights and bill of responsibilities. And that might be a good place to start to think about how we're going to work together in a situation like that. It's kind of a long answer.
No, I think it was very useful. And I don't want to hijack that Q&A, but if I may add just one little comment, that you can always find an enemy of your enemy and become a friend with them. And then maybe you too can convince your client. But yeah.
I have a phrase for that too. I talk about looking for allies. Looking for allies that you can work together with who share your perspective. Yeah, no, a very good point, Roman. Thank you.
Moving next, a question from Gabriel. In the real world, it's common to find that stakeholders do not have much time to dedicate to you when you need to elicit your requirements. Is there a script that you could recommend for those cases that allow us to reach the key requirements?
Well, that's the same kind of problem as we were just talking about, one aspect of it anyway. It almost boils down to, look, you should know what I need. Call me when you're done. I don't have time to talk to you. And again, I think you have to point out the risks and say, if I'm waiting for information or if I'm waiting for an answer to a question, then that's blocking us from proceeding. So what are we going to do then? I don't have a script for that because it depends on the personalities, the power dynamics in the organization and so forth. But I think that's still an aspect of agreeing on how we're going to work together. And make sure that people have bought into that and understand the consequences if something doesn't get done or something goes slow. I have a personal philosophy. I try to stay off the critical path. You know what the critical path is on a project. It's the sequence of steps that leads to the shortest outcome. And anything that delays a task on the critical path delays the entire project by that same time. So if you're waiting 2 days to get an answer from somebody to a critical question and you can't proceed without that answer, you're going to be 2 days late. Of course, people just expect you to make that up, but that's, as we know, ridiculous. So I try to stay off the critical path. I try personally never to be the bottleneck that is holding something up. And so we need to let people know, well, if I don't get this answer, here's what could happen. So maybe you can find a little more time to work with me on that. Or at least we can set up some mechanism by which we can get those critical path items addressed quickly. But I don't have a script.
Unfortunately, hopefully
I don't have scripts for things. I have thought processes.
Well, but maybe you will write it in your next book, so everyone can just steal it from you. There is another very interesting one, I guess. Carol is asking, considering your extensive expertise in this field, she's curious to hear your thoughts on the role of AI throughout the requirement cycle. How do you see AI impacting requirements elicitation, analysis, and review processes? And what opportunities or challenges do you anticipate in leveraging AI to improve requirements engineering practices?
Well, that's probably not a 30-second answer. Uh, Actually, I anticipated that question. I get that question with every presentation I do these days about AI. And I have to say, I know virtually nothing about AI. Okay. But so I think it's probably a very long conversation to think about the full answer to that very well worded question because there's so many aspects to it, specification, analysis, all those. I think there are good opportunities for AI to help a BA in general by maybe reminding them of things that they might not have thought of otherwise. For example, if you come up with a requirement and you feed it into your magic AI machine and it says, look, here's 5 exceptions that you haven't identified that I think you might want to consider. So I think getting reminders to look at those sorts of things to get a more holistic understanding of a given requirement, that could be very helpful. An AI might be aware of business rules that apply to a specific situation, which I think could also be a big help. Some people have created over the years products that are supposed to scan through a written requirement specification in some form and identify ambiguities and conflicts and confusion and so forth. And now, of course, they're all saying, well, this is AI driven. I don't even know what that means. What's the difference in a case like that between AI and a good algorithm? I don't know what they mean. I think that's just a buzzword in many cases. But I think the risk we have to watch out for, other than the fact that AI is going to destroy the entire planet within a few years, other than that risk, when it comes to business analysis, I think we could fall into a trap of trusting it too much. We could say, well, I ran it through the AI and it said I was done, or it gave me this information and so now I'm done, and so I trust it. And I think we want to be very careful not to just delegate our thinking to an AI. In 1989, probably before many of you were even born, I wrote an article called The Laws of Computing. If you search for Karl Wiegers and Laws of Computing, you can find it online somewhere. And it was the kind of article that's on the last page of a magazine, kind of humorous sort of thing. Wiegers' Laws of Computing. I think I had 13 or 14 laws. But the 7th law, Wiegers' 7th law of computing, says that artificial intelligence is no substitute for the real thing. Now, maybe soon that won't be true. But in the meantime, let's not overly rely on AI to do our thinking for us. Let's use it as an assistant to fill in the gaps in our knowledge, to point out things that maybe we had missed, to more efficiently pull together knowledge than we can in certain cases. But based on the fact that, as I said, I don't know very much about AI, that's probably the only useful answer I can give. Sorry.
No worries. Again, we will wait for another book. Maybe it will appear. Maybe you will ask AI for that. There are also,
I'll just have an AI write the book for me, and I'm good. Perfect.
Or assist writing the book for you. I have to mention there are a lot of good comments from people, mostly saying thank you for the presentation, but also mentioning all the hints and tips from the presentation and for all of your books. So we need to dedicate a moment for that. Thanks.
Great.
Thank
you. It's always wonderful. It means a lot to me when people write to me and say that they found my work helpful. That's why you write these things. I love to write, and I share things that I know with other people who might find them useful or interesting or even entertaining. And so it's always great when I hear from people who said that we accomplished that. Thank you.
As I'm trying to navigate through questions and people started deleting them, so please don't delete your questions because it just moves the chat. There is a question from Mamuka. I hope pronounced it right. What tool or tools are you using for visualizing requirements with diagrams and mockups?
True confession here. I've been retired for 16 years, so I don't actually stay current on all of the tools that are available. They change so fast, and one company buys another company, and so forth. So I can't make specific tool recommendations. I know that Enterprise Architect is a very popular modeling tool. I know a guy who's worked with that a lot and teaches classes on it. So Enterprise Architect is one, but I'm sure there are many others that can do either general modeling capabilities or more specific. Some may just do data modeling, for example. I would suggest not using just a general purpose drawing tool. If you're going to be serious about modeling, one of the things that you want to do is use a tool that knows the syntax and the rules about whatever kinds of diagrams you want to draw, because it can then validate your models and say, hey, wait a minute, you have a circle here with arrows coming in, but no arrows going out. That's a problem. You're missing something. So tools can help you validate your diagrams and find possible errors are very helpful. But I just don't try to stay current with all the different tools. Same thing with requirements management tools. People often ask me, well, which requirements management tool do you recommend? The last time I looked, I knew that there were at least 35 requirements management tools. Their capabilities change over time, and their pricing changes. So I don't even try to keep up with that. But I think I've got some information actually in the big book about how to use a requirements management tool, how to think about bringing it into your culture and your practices. But I think that's maybe more useful than specifically saying, buy this tool because tomorrow it'll be obsolete. So I try not to stay on top of that. Being old and retired provides many luxuries, such as not having to stay on top of that.
And then you're bombarded with questions around AI, right?
Yes. And I unfortunately can't answer all of those questions. Angela Wick, I believe, is writing a book on AI and business analysis. So you might look into that. Angela Wick has got a lot of online presence in the business analysis world. I don't know what the status of her book is, but I'm pretty sure she was working on one.
I was trying to type. We'll try to find it and share the name afterwards. There is another question, but I seem to lose. Yeah, and I guess you will like it. It's a question from Andrew, and he has a question around documenting requirements in Agile. In Agile, or to be more specific, in Startup Agile, results are of a higher value than the documentation. So what your thoughts are on the balance between lack of documentation of requirements and more like necessary documents comparing to the value, to the outcome? Like how to balance between. So I think in other words, yeah.
Sure. And that, I think the right way to think about that is, again, a matter of risk. When you have 3 or 4 or 5 people who sit together and work together and are in constant communication and exchanging information, you can do things with less documentation than if you have people in different places who are not collaborating quite as intimately. So you think about how much do we need to remember just from person to person, day to day, and how much do we need to remember for months down the road. If you're just starting out with something, I think it's still valuable to record some of the important business requirements knowledge to make sure everyone is focused toward a common objective. And I go back to this value that I believe very strongly, that the cost of recording knowledge is small compared to the cost of acquiring knowledge. And so I frankly don't understand why people are so reluctant to write down what they learn about requirements or anything else. That's not the expensive part. The hard part is figuring it out. writing it down is fairly simple transcription after that. You can even use voice recognition software to capture it almost in real time or quickly. So I don't have a lot of patience with people that are saying, well, we don't need to do that. Memories are not perfect. I used to work on a team, small group, just 3 of us, many years ago. We had a weekly meeting where we'd get together. 2 of us were in one building, one was in another building, and we'd agree what we were going to be doing for the next week, things incrementally, but with a plan. And on 2 occasions, one of the developers walked away from a meeting with a different understanding than the other 2 developers had. And so he did something that week that we ended up throwing away because he went this way because he didn't have the same understanding that we were going that way. And that happened twice. Well, how much of that do you want to tolerate? Is that okay in your group, or are you using techniques to ensure that that's low risk? It's all a matter of risk. You don't write stuff down just to write it down. You write it down so that we don't work in different directions. You also write it down so that later on down the road, if people have to come back to that, they have something to use as reference. Otherwise, you have to go do reverse engineering on the existing product and figure out what's in here and why did we do that? I don't know why we did it. Nobody says why we did it. Well, maybe we should write down why we did it so people understand in the future. So that's why I use risk thinking. And I think recording knowledge is not expensive compared to discovering it or having to go do reverse engineering. I call that software archaeology, to then get down into the layers of history and try to figure something out and maybe not figure it out exactly right. That's why you record information.
Awesome. Great answer. Moving next, there is another one related to change management and training employees. So what are your key tips for implementing change management? That's like the first part of a question. And the second one, what are your key tips for training employees after a new feature is built?
Yeah, 2 very different questions. First question, I think change management is involves a process that is pretty much the same across many teams. It's something we can borrow processes from other places and then adapt them to our processes, our environment. So really, change management involves several things. One is deciding who your decision makers are. It's developing a process for collecting change requests, whether those are new stories or revised stories or enhancements to an existing product or whatever. But you need a mechanism for people to submit those. They have to go somewhere. Someone has to do some impact analysis. That, I think, is a very important step, is to think through what it costs to do this. What else will we have to change if we add this feature or this modification? What's the cost of that change, so that you can decide a sensible thing to do and when is the right time to do it? What's the priority with respect to all the other things we have in our backlog? So I think every organization needs a change process, and it could be very simple. It's like, oh, you have a question? Ask Roman, he'll take care of it. All right, fine. But maybe some other people need to do some technical analysis and tell Roman what they learned, so Roman can then say, all right, compared to everything else that I know about, here's where that fits in, and here's when we'll schedule it, or here's why we decided not to do it. So I think every organization should create even a simple change process, change control process, that everyone knows how to follow. I did that at Kodak in our small group. And my philosophy was, if a change request doesn't come into the process, as far as I'm concerned, it does not exist. I might walk down the hall and somebody would say, hey, Karl, I've got an idea for something I want to add to that system you guys are working on. And I'd say, fine, put it into the process. It was a very simple online form to fill out. And incidentally, I'm talking about like 30 years ago. This is old stuff. And most of the time, no one ever submitted them. And I'm thinking, if this was not important enough to you to take 1 minute to send it in to me, then I don't care at all. Now, maybe I'll say, okay, I understand. I'll put that in to the system when I get back to my office. Fine. I don't care how it gets in there. But if it's not going through the process, it doesn't exist. I don't spend any effort on it. So you need to develop a change culture, and you need to develop an understanding of who makes the decisions and on what basis. So again, it doesn't have to be complicated, but I think it should be documented, and I think it should be well communicated. Now, the question of how to train people, users after a new feature is installed, I don't think there's a specific answer to that. It depends on how complicated it is, how much impact it has on people, and again, what's the risk of letting them figure it out versus doing a training class. I don't think there's a single answer to that question. Or we could take the approach that Apple and app developers do these days, which is like, just figure it out. If you can't figure it out, go online. Maybe somebody else has already figured it out. In other words, no training, no documentation, just figure it out. Not very efficient.
And again, if I may, but I will use the examples that you are also involved in. At least if you're doing an online webinar, at least do a dry run at least a few days in advance if you're introducing a new platform, because otherwise it might not work. So at least we know enough time.
It might not work, and that's embarrassing. Good idea.
Another question, moving into BAs who are into technical world. What is the role of the BA in technical specifications? For instance, which program calls, which services, with what input, etc. Is it something that must be defined and documented from the BA side? Usually there is not enough time to ask developers all the details of the solution design.
I would not generally consider that to be a BA function. Business analysis is a strange discipline. It's really a bridging function between, users and customers, stakeholders, and technical people who build solutions and modify solutions. It's a bridging function. It's a very essential function. Some BAs come from a business background or an application domain background without a lot of technical knowledge, but maybe with good communication skills or excellent understanding of the user domain. Some BAs come from the technical side and they were developers in the past, but they kind of migrate to this bridging function. So they can come from either side, and both are fine because it's really a question of the skills, the knowledge, and the personality of the people involved. And what they have to do is understand, so what don't I know? If I have to communicate, learn to be able to communicate effectively with the others. It's very possible that an organization might have someone in a BA function who came from a hard technical background and knows that, okay, if we're going to implement this change, here's how you're going to have to architect it. But a lot of times they won't know that. And I think it's really up to each organization, each project team, to define those roles and responsibilities based on the people involved, so that, number one, people don't end up doing someone else's work and they collide, maybe give developers different answers. Number two, they don't both assume someone else is doing it and nobody does it. So I like things to be real explicit. Like I've always said, I don't need to be in control, but I like things to be in control. Doesn't have to be me in charge. That's not important. I want the right people making the right decisions and performing the right actions. So that means we need to, again, talk about how are we going to collaborate on this project. And otherwise people can assume, well, I'm responsible for that architecture part, and someone else says, no, you don't do that. You go figure out what they need. We'll figure out architecture. So let's talk about it. Let's get the people on the team to agree on those roles and responsibilities to make sure that there's no collisions and that nothing gets overlooked. Many of these questions, Roman, I think people will say, well, he's just giving a consultant's answer, which is, it depends. And that's correct. In almost every one of these questions, the correct answer is, it depends. I don't know anything about the context or the personalities or the nature of the project. So I don't like to give very specific answers to, oh, well, always do this and you'll always be fine, because it depends on the context. But I can give you a thought process, again, to maybe consider how to approach the problem in a given situation, which might lead to a very different outcome in another situation.
I'm sure you will do great, because when I was introducing you, the first sentence I said that you're a principal consultant. So we were not focusing on anything else. So I'm sure that will do. There is another interesting question from the BA perspective, because you talked about how and why. So Samantha is asking, how do you recommend dealing with a client who who insists on solutionizing?
Oh, it happens all the time. I've had people, when I was at a company teaching classes, they said, our clients give us requirements, they give us solutions. And the first thing you need to do is detect that you're getting solutions, okay? And sometimes it's not obvious, because you get a solution, and I think what you need to do as a BA is you need to kind of back up and say, okay, if this was the answer, what was the question? In other words, you're telling me build this or implement it that way, then the right question to ask is why? Why does it have to be done that way? And the answer you get might be, well, that just seemed like a good idea, in which case it's just a solution idea. And in other cases, they might say, well, I want it to be done that way because then it's consistent with the rest of the application used for the user experience, and it will reduce the learning curve. That could be a good reason to do things in a specific way that the customer indicated. So what we're trying to do is distinguish, when we're exploring solutions, we're trying to distinguish a true constraint. Something has to be done in a certain way, from just an idea or suggestion to help people understand what the customer has in mind. So ask why several times, if necessary, to try to reach that understanding so you can distinguish a constraint from a suggestion. The second thing we want to do is on a larger scale, not just maybe a function scale, but on a application scale, is make sure we understand the problem first. You know, that was, I think, the very first practice I described, is understand the problem before we converge on a solution. And so sometimes people might give you a solution, like build this application, but if you do the root cause analysis to try to understand what problem this solution is solving, you might find that it only solves part of the problem, or it solves a problem that isn't really a problem, or that it won't solve a problem at all, or that it's a problem, but that problem is already solvable in another way. Or you might say, yes, that sounds like a perfect solution, let's build it. So I think that gets back to my suggestion that you should never assume that a presented solution or a presented problem is necessarily correct, but do that root cause analysis to get a confidence that we can understand the problem, we can see the connections to the solution, and it may be that the proposed solution is partly, mostly correct, but we want to adjust it. And I think a good customer would appreciate the value that the BA adds by going through that thought process. I can give you a real life example. So my wife belongs to a church, and one time some years ago, the people in her church were saying, we don't have enough members in our church. We want to grow the congregation. And so they said, well, let's try this. Let's do that. And I said, well, wait a minute. And I'm not a church-going guy, but I know how to solve problems. I said, wait a minute. Let's first ask, why do we not have as many people in the church as we would like? And if you can understand why there's a problem, then you can get some root causes, and you can do actions that target those specific root causes, rather than just saying, let's try this and see if it works. So that's what I suggested. That was my BA contribution to her church.
Maybe it was a plan from the beginning. Maybe they were just thinking how to get you engaged, and they just moved directly into how.
And that's very natural general. I mean, that's what we do. We think solutions. I've fallen into the same myself when I was talking to people. Here's what I want. Well, let's think about why first. Oh, yes, I skipped that part.
Yeah, we've all been in those shoes. There is another question / favor. Andre is asking if you can please repeat that all changes require trade-offs. He would like to record it for his clients.
Yes, I can repeat that. In fact, what I will say is that number one, change always has a price. Okay. Even discussing a change that someone suggested is not free, even if you decide not to do it. The time you spend discussing the change, exploring it, has a price. Second, there are trade-offs because people will say, oh, could you add this one little feature? I mean, this is like a Dilbert cartoon. Can you add this little feature? Sure, we can put that in. Oh, great, change is free. Here's 1,000 new features. No, that's not the impression we want to give. We want people to understand that, yes, we can make changes. Yes, we can make additions. Yes, they will all cost you something. They might cost time. They might cost a trade-off of saying, if we add this, that won't work anymore. They might cost trade-offs if we add this and you still want it by Thursday, something else doesn't get put in. Which should that be as priority? But there's always a price. There's always a trade-off. It doesn't matter if you like that or not. It's just the way the world works.
It's been mentioned 1 hour 45 minutes into the webinar, so everyone can just easily find it. If we now can change an angle and move from BA questions into more personal questions, Istvan is asking, what was your biggest failure, worst decision in a career perspective, and how did you come over it?
And worst decision or biggest failure in the career. You know, the biggest failure was kind of funny, and it wasn't a bad decision. It's just the way things worked out. So I have a PhD in organic chemistry, and I loved chemistry. I thought chemistry was really cool. So I learned chemistry. I got a PhD. I taught at the University of Illinois for a year. I did a postdoctoral research year. And then I went to work at Kodak, a big photographic company. I was going to be a chemist, but they didn't let me be an organic chemist. I became a photographic research scientist, which involved some chemistry, but nothing like what I was learned about or was interested in. And I was very frustrated. So I think it was a failure, but it wasn't a mistake. Okay. It was a reasonable job to take because I was lied to by the first boss I had. He said, I'm setting up a lab for you to do organic chemistry work along with photography. And that was bullshit. Okay, that was not what he was setting up for me. And I didn't get that excited about the photographic work. And I loved chemistry, but my second interest was computers. So I then started doing more work with computers. This was in the early 1980s. And I started developing applications, and that grew into me then eventually being a developer full-time and then a manager. So that was a good decision. So I guess I've made professionally more good decisions than bad decisions, fortunately. But I still think chemistry was really cool. I think I could have been a pretty good chemist, but this got okay. I kept my own jobs, basically. I just kept inventing new jobs that were valuable for the company, what I was told to do. But very important point. If you ever try that, make sure that you're never in a situation where someone says, yes, you did this good stuff, but we asked you to do that other stuff and you didn't do it. I always made sure I did my assignment, but then I'd go play with computers.
Yeah, because everyone will ask you for your main part, not for how good you want the project doing project management. Everyone will ask you how good was your business analysis first. There is another personal question, I would say. Is there a plans for the 4th edition of the big book? And I guess by big book, people again refer to this lovely book.
Right, right. So I'll tell you one of the other best decisions, the single best professional decision I made was working with Joy Beatty as my co-author on the Big Orange book. Okay, Joy Beatty was just a terrific co-author. She's a dear friend, a wonderful person, very smart. I have huge respect for her. We're still good friends, 10 years later. The collaboration worked very well. So Joy and I joke about a fourth edition, or the publisher language, they call that a 4E. And, this was a lot of work. If you write a 650-page book, you people think, oh, it's a lot to read. Yeah, try writing it. That's more. But we thought about it. There's really not a lot I would change. Sure, we could add some more agile stuff and whatnot, and someday you'll have to add a chapter on AI and stuff. But I think pretty much everything in the book is still valid. It's still usable. I would say things a little different in some places or something. But we don't have a vision for, oh, yeah, we greatly improved this. But it was really kind of us joking around about the 4E that led me to write this book. This is like a paradigm shift, a paradigm shift. Instead of saying, let's write another even bigger book, let's write a very small book. Let's take the most important ideas and practices, and this is all new material. This isn't stuff that's in the books. The topics are, but the presentation's all new. And that's what led me to the idea of saying, not everybody wants a great big book, maybe for reference, but not to read. But I'll bet everybody could read this. And this is small enough and easy enough to understand that you can give it to your user representatives, give it to your manager, and they'll understand. They'll say, oh, now I see why you want us to talk about prioritization. I see why that's important, or whatever. So that actually, talking about a fourth edition led me to do this book instead. So I don't think there's going to be a 4E. And if there is, I'm not going to write it. We'll let Joy write it.
Or, as we established a couple of questions back, you can ask AI to assist you.
Some people have talked about using AI to write articles and stuff. I like to write. To me, asking an AI to write part of my article or book for me, that's like outsourcing my wine tasting. That's stupid. I like to write. I like to wine. Why would I have somebody else do that for me? I want to preserve my voice. I want to tell my story, whatever it is. And I enjoy that whole process. So I would never consider using AI for anything other than maybe, like using Grammarly to proofread things and stuff. But no, I'll stick with what's in here instead of the AI.
Thank you. I feel like this is a great question to probably start wrapping it up. But has business analysis changed since your first book? And if so, in what ways?
Well, that is a good question. It changed in a lot of ways. When I wrote the first edition of the Software Requirements book, so I've written 14 books. The Software Requirements Essentials is the latest. The first edition of the Software Requirements book was published in 1999. That was my second book. My first book was called Creating a Software Engineering Culture. But back in 1999, there was no IIBA. Business analysis wasn't that popular a term. People talked about requirements analysis, requirement engineering, or systems analysts. So the vocabulary has changed. The profession through multiple organizations like IIBA, PMI, IREB, several organizations have helped elevate it to recognize that it's a profession with a particular skill set, a particular role on projects. I think that's very good. I disagree with a number of the things that the IIBA does or talks about, but those are fairly small things. And I think people have come to understand that this is an essential role on software projects, but also the thinking, the thought process is something you can apply to a wide variety of situations. For example, we had a nasty freeze here, an ice storm in January, and we lost power. It got very cold in my house because we have an all-electric house, no other source of heat or cooking. And I am now the proud owner of a generator. My generator will power my entire house if we lose power again. And I use BA type skills in going through that process of understanding the problem, exploring possible solutions, constraints. There's things I couldn't do as possible solutions because of the constraints in our house and so forth. And I didn't write a requirement spec, but I certainly went through that thought process, and I'm very happy with the solution we came up with and has been implemented. So that the way of thinking, I think, applies to many situations beyond software projects, and then it's essential to projects. And also that there's a distinction between business analyst as a job title and business analysis as a project role or a function that multiple people might perform. Back when I started doing requirement stuff, there weren't a lot of other people doing things. Like I had e-learning versions of my courses that sold quite well. But now there's a lot of people that teach this kind of material, which is also good, but makes it harder to compete. And so I retired. That was easier.
Thank you. Actually, on that note, when you were talking about your former education and your PhD, actually from my friends that I know who are also doing business analysis, like 5 years ago or like 7, I would say, it was very strange in a good way to read all of those cases from a different industry rather than tech, because I think especially like nowadays when you say I work as business analyst in tech, and if you try to kind of talk about it, nobody will come up with an example from a different sector. Everyone will be just using, I don't know, whatever technology, but nobody will go into like chemistry or like economics, finance. So that was really, really inspiring to look at it from a different, totally different perspective.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, anytime you're in a situation where you have knowledge or education in one discipline and you're working in a different discipline, you can find ways to apply the thinking and practices and principles. If you only have experience in one discipline, that's harder to do. But I found that I think like a scientist. I'm a scientist by background and how my brain works. And so I found that made me, for example, a very analytical test when I did a lot of software testing. I was a developer for many years. I wrote the assembly language tutorial column for a magazine for 2 years. And I've done a lot of software development and testing and quality work and stuff, and bringing my scientific mindset. And that's probably why I'm comfortable with documentation, writing things down, my scientific background. So different backgrounds that these bring allow them to cross-fertilize, I think, in a way that many disciplines do.
I totally agree. Yeah, it's always easier when you have more knowledge, so you can find answer from look at the answer from different angles rather than just like give me a checklist and I will do A, B, and C.
Right. Exactly.
Well, Karl, it was a great pleasure / honor to host that webinar and to listen to your presentation. Just before we're gonna finish, we will bring back the slide with the code, because some people wrote there was an error saying that the code has expired. So for everyone who is listening to us, please go to our community and subscribe to the event. You can find the link in the comment section wherever you're looking at the live stream, and we will send that code. We will double check it on our end afterwards, and we will send a follow-up to everyone registered to the event. So please go ahead and register. If you haven't done so, if you
Yeah.
found that streaming somehow, please just go back. Even if you're watching us now on YouTube after the event, if it's not like year or so, you can also register. But please go back to our community page and do that.
If there's an error that code is not being accepted or something, let me know and I will check with the publisher and we will get another code and then that's what you could send out. So we'll find a way to fix that. And people, of course, are always welcome to write to me directly if there's a question or concern.
I can totally support. Please write to Karl. He will be happy to reply to all of your messages and comments on LinkedIn. That's for sure. Just a last point from our side. Please go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel, to our Global BA community page. Follow our news. We already had a lot of nice recordings from different people, and now we're gonna have this amazing talk that will probably keep bringing people to our page. So we just hope you guys share, like, and subscribe. And Karl, I'm joining hundreds of people in saying thank you for the webinar, because I guess there are more than 300, 400 people watching us live.
Great. Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me and for your good MC work, Roman.
My pleasure. Well, at least I wasn't replaced with AI yet for this event, so hopefully that will not happen soon. Thank you, Karl. It was a pleasure.
For me.
No, not you. I mean,
thanks very much.
Not yet. Okay. Good day.
Bye-bye.